So tonight we're working on chapters 12 and 13, and if you guys are looking at our course shell, chapter 12 is actually kind of optional. It's an extra credit chapter. In fact, why don't I bring that up on screen? I think it's worthy of doing that. So let's look at .NET here, and we'll go to Unit 9. Really one of the penultimate things that we do with working with application building is we get to the point where we know how to build applications, but then we want to really be able to store the data, retrieve data, and the best way to do that, folks, is with a database. And that's not an uncommon mechanism to use. Even with all the new technologies that we have out there where some databases can be localized, like you were learning in Web 2, the preferred way is still to have a database that runs on a server. Typically, databases will run on servers that are independent of your actual web servers, and that's usually done for security reasons. I know that when you're learning here and you work on Apollo, we run MySQL and we run our web server all on the same machine. That is not typical out in the field. In fact, that's considered highly insecure, and we have had security issues in the past where I've had clever students that have figured out how to bypass security on one side or the other, and all of a sudden they're messing either with the web server, the SQL server, or MySQL server. Anyhow, long story short, we are working on the 3 chapters in the book now that deal with what databases are, how to connect to them, how to create them, and the like. Now, before you actually get into doing any of the real work, which is in chapters 13 and 14, they have a chapter 12 that talks about what a database is, what the SQL, the structured query language is, and how to work with those tools. What the book suggests, and it's a good suggestion, is to install an express version of SQL Server. To my knowledge, I know that SQL Server 2012 Express is still out there. I think it's still on Microsoft Imagine and DreamSpark. Do not quote me on that, though, because that's been burning me a lot this semester, because they seem to be fading out some products. But SQL Server 2012 is still very prominent out in the field. The more modern versions are SQL Server 2016. I think there's a 2017, and they're coming out with a 2019. For my money, I wouldn't go past the 2016 version at this point. Really, there are not a lot of functional differences with the product. You know, for the things that we're doing, we're going to be creating tables. We might make a few relationships, and we're reading and writing information back and forth. You know, so really, for the most part, we're working with simple flat files, even though it's connecting to a real database. So one thing you can do is you can go ahead and download SQL Server. So for those of you not familiar with the Microsoft Imagine program, I'm trying to remember how to connect here, gtc.onthehub.com, and at the beginning of every semester, they go through and they add every registered IT student to the list here. And if you've never used this site before, you have to sign in. But if you've never signed in before, you have to hit register. If you put in your gateway email address, it should auto-recognize you and immediately create your account, but you do have to register, right? And you do have to use your gateway student email account to do it. So I think everybody here in the room obviously is pretty in tune with that. So go ahead and actually sign in. And if you hear me calling this DreamSpark, that's because up until a few months back, that's what it was called. Now they're calling it Microsoft Imagine, so I apologize. If I say DreamSpark, I mean Imagine. Okay. And really all this is a third-party vendor site that's responsible for distributing Microsoft software. In days past, and with this I mean 6 months ago, right, welcome to IT, it used to be any product that Microsoft put out for software, and I mean any product you could find through the site with the exception of Office. Why? Because Office is their cash cow. It always has. That's where they've made the most amount of money, and they're probably going to continue to do so. But any other product, so if I wanted to get any version of Visual Studio ever made, it was here, right? But recently, they changed it. In fact, they eliminated a lot of old software, and that's probably to everybody's benefit, because Do you really want to be learning like Visual Studio 2008 in 2018 when we're 5 versions past it? Probably not.
I think it seems to follow, like Microsoft licensing does, you can buy a license, you can go 2 versions back, and that's all they let you do.
That's right, that's right. And I think you're right, and I think they're transitioning that into this environment, which isn't a bad thing. It doesn't mean if you really wanted an older version, you can find it. And you're seeing right here, right in the sidebar, they have a thing, SQL Server 2017 is now available, and for a lot of people to say, why would I get anything but the latest one? And if that's what you want, go for it. Just do it. Not a big deal. Yep, you can get Office for free from Gateway through a separate process. I forget what the URL is, but I think I might have a link in the resources page. Right. Okay. And you can also get it through Gateway too, where you can either run Microsoft Office right through your browser, right? That's Office 365. And I think for a lot of people that's fine because you don't have to install anything, right? Especially if you have an older computer, you don't have disk space. But you can also download it and install it on up to 5 machines. Now, of course, when you stop being a student, that changes, and then they'll start nagging you for money. But who knows? As long as your student email account is active, I think it'll be okay. All right. That aside, go up to the search bar here and just do a really quick search. And then notice that they do have various versions here available. And you can see there's lots of them. So it does require a little bit of study. And I would be surprised. Yeah, so they still have the 2012 versions out there. It's interesting though. I'm trying, well, maybe they don't. Yeah, it's Windows Server. That's not SQL Server. So it looks like they're capping it here as well. Well, but what? Okay, that's 2016. Well, whatever you decide to do, make sure that you choose a version that's not too intensive. Brian? For 2012. So you can still go out and get the 2012 SQL Server Express, but you just can't do it through this interface. Okay, so that's what one of my students is telling me, because apparently you just recently did it? 2 days ago? Okay. So it's still out there, you just can't get it through this interface. And that actually, the version that's suggested by the book will do everything we need it to do. It's a lot more lightweight than any of the other stuff that you might have. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, in terms of, which one do you get? Like, holy cow, a data center edition of any product, well, we don't want Windows Server. But if you did developer, enterprise, standard, or web, any one of those would be fine. For the kind of stuff that we're doing, web might be more than adequate. And maybe that's actually what they call the Express version now. And I'm not educated enough on to tell you for sure that's what it is, but my guess would be exactly that, because web people, they're usually storing really simple things, they're not storing a lot, and they don't need like heavy transaction capability. If you were actually doing something where you were running a company off of it, and there's going to be dozens or hundreds of databases running off of the same engine, which is often the case, then enterprise is definitely the one that you want to get. So I'm just going to take a look at this and just look at it really quick and see like which one do I want to low total cost of ownership for web hosters and web apps provide scale. All right, sounds good. And then I would just click on add to cart and I would go through the process of downloading it and installing it. Now, if you're going to do that, I'm going to tell you right up front, folks, these are intensive products. This is not installing Notepad++, right? It is probably equivalent to installing Visual Studio. So it's going to be a large install, large download. It will take a while. And for some of you, this might be the best way to work. I'm not a huge fan of installing it on personal equipment. Usually I'm smart and I bring my school machine, but of course I forgot tonight. So I can't work that way. So what I was doing preemptively before everybody got here is I was connecting to one of our machines here, and I'm going to show everybody in the video if you want to forego the process of connecting or installing SQL Server on your own machine, that you can follow the procedure I'm going to use, which is connecting to our database that I have on our SharePoint server here, which is accessible to students. And the one thing I do ask, though, as students, is that you please don't share the connection information or the passwords to the machine. And in fact, I'm going to have to go through a little bit of a rigmarole when I post these videos out on YouTube to block that information out, so that the general public doesn't find out and start cracking into our database. Okay, so let's say you're going to follow that approach. Let's go ahead and bring up your Visual Studio. And then, typically we'll go into Visual Studio and, we'll get a project going. And in fact, let's just go ahead and do that. Let's just make a new project just to goof around with. So I'm going to create a new project, and what I'm going to create is just an empty ASP.NET website. I don't care where you put it. We're not really going to build anything in it, but it's just to kind of have something in the background that's up and active as a project, and then we're going to connect to our database and make sure we can get everybody working. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Let's give it a moment to build up the project resources. All right, and then the thing that I'd like you to notice is down here we have our Solution Explorer, but at the bottom of that Solution Explorer sidebar, there's actually different tabs, and depending on the version of Visual Studio you have installed, you'll get different ones. But you should have one called Server Explorer. If for some reason, folks, you do not see that tab, you can go to your View menu, and you can actually trigger Server Explorer from the menu here. On some older versions of Server Explorer, it will appear on the left-hand sidebar. I'm not sure why mine is popping up on the right. How many of you are on the right? Or how many of you are on the left? Yeah, I think it's more typical that you see it on the left. So at some point I must have rearranged my windows, or it doesn't matter where it appears, it's just a tab, right? In that Server Explorer, you're going to see these 4 different categories, and you can see that you can connect to more than just databases here. You can connect to other servers, you can connect to other applications, you can connect to SharePoint resources, you can connect to the Azure cloud infrastructure that Microsoft has, and then the one that we're concerned with is what we call data connections. What you're going to want to do at this point is right-click that and then choose Add Connection. All right. You might get an interface, depending on what you're running, where you might see this screen first. Is anybody getting this screen first? Okay. If that happens, what they're really asking you to do is, well, tell us what kind of database you're connecting to. All right? And what we're going to connect to is SQL Server. So whether it's local or remote. And what the book is asking you to do in Chapter 12 is to install SQL Server Express. You get it up and running, you get logged in, you create your accounts and whatever you do, and then you connect to it. Right? And that's pretty typical for people doing development on a local machine. In a more realistic environment, when you go out into the workplace and you either are working with a live application or even in development, they'll usually have a SQL Server or some sort of database product out there that you can connect to remotely. Usually it runs on a separate machine. It'll have all different types of authentication. To connect to it, you really need to be informed how to connect to it. It's not going to be one of those things where you're going to guess. In some cases, by virtue of logging into your workstation, you'll have a network level login for Windows that authenticates on a server somewhere through Active Directory, and then that will automatically log you into the database. This is not what we're doing here, because I do not want to give people server accounts on our Windows server. I just want to give them database access. So what I've done is the same thing that I do on MySQL, where I created my junk AAA account, right? So there's your username right off the bat. And then with a simple password to go with it, which I'm about to share with you, but not out on YouTube. Sorry, YouTube people. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to select the one that I have, which is Microsoft SQL Server. But notice that there are other options here. By default, you can connect to an Oracle database, so the connection tools are built right in. You can also connect to, notice that the first entry and the fourth entry say Microsoft Access Database File, right? And you guys may have done this in Intro to Programming if that was one of the courses that you took, where you just pull in a file and it's usually an MDF file, Microsoft Database File, and you just take the whole file, which contains the whole database, and you just connect to it and work with the file directly. Visual Studio can do that. You can also do that with files that do come from SQL Server. Then you also have this Microsoft ODBC data source, which is actually more of like a universal connector type that allows you to connect to a bunch of different other things. And then you have the option for other. And other would include things like MySQL databases, for example, or other types. There's many, many different ones. SQL Server is what we're going to use here. There is a drop-down at the bottom here, and you are just going to go with whatever the default is. Okay, please don't change that. So it says Microsoft SQL Server, say OK. And then you should end up on this screen, I'm hoping. Nods? Okay, good. It's bad when people don't nod. All right. We do have a machine that you can connect to. And right now, I'm not going to tell you with any degree of certainty whether or not, if you are off campus, whether you need VPN to connect to this. My understanding is no. Okay? However, if you are off campus and trying to connect and it is not working using the stuff that I'm providing here, please turn on a VPN connection and try again. Okay, so the server name is sharepoint.gtc.edu. That's a server that's run by our web department here. I'm actually the admin on it, but all of our web faculty have admin access to it, so if you ever have issues. And it's very simply, it's a Windows Server 2012 installation that's running Microsoft SQL Server 2012 on top of it as one of its products or applications. The authentication method that you are going to want to choose is going to be SQL Server authentication. So this is the thing I was talking about before. In many enterprise environments, by virtue of logging into your own machine, you're already logged into the server automatically. It's proxied and handled automatically. That is not how this is set up. So I actually have a separate database account, so the database engine itself has a capability of having user logins with passwords that are independent of Windows, or it can leverage Windows login system as well. So we're going to choose this option, and then here comes the username. And then I'm going to type in the password. You guys in the room already know what that is, and I'm not saying it out loud because people on YouTube do not need to know. And then I would suggest clicking Save My Password. And then you can see if it works by very simply hitting this drop-down box. If you actually have a list of various databases, including one that's called AAAAA, or AA, right? Depending on how you want to look at it, right? Thumbs up. That's the one we want to connect to. Now you can also see that if you were working with a database file where you could attach it. And that's actually not a bad way to work, folks. Believe it or not, you can do all the stuff just like that. And you can take that database file and import it into a real database and have it work. So a lot of developers, depending on their paradigms, they'll choose different approaches. Don't worry about anything on the Advanced tab, but do click the Test Connection button, and I'm hoping that you guys all get a yes. Okay, that's wonderful. So we're all connected now. All right. Then, now I'll come and help you. Don't worry. Once you do have that connection established, you will see under Data Connections here in the Server Explorer listing of the SharePoint server database. And you're going to see that it's got its own unique identifier where SP-server is actually our machine name, right? Dot the database name, dot whatever DBO means. I think it means database object or something like that. Now, if you expand that arrow, You're going to see that you can access the resources of the database just like you would if you were in SQL Server Management Studio. And right now there's no tables created. So if you click to expand tables, which is predominantly what we're going to be doing, is working with tables, whatever tables you have would be listed there. Now, as we're working on our exercises, what I'm going to ask you guys to do is if you create a table for your work and you're attaching to this database, please put your name on it to make it unique to you. Okay? So Jason, call yours Jason. You know, something where I can identify you. I know most of my students on a first name basis, although the strangest thing I have, I think like 3 Brians with Y's. Okay, so Brian, just maybe add your last initial to it. So that'll be the case. So if you have this going, this is our database connection piece, and hopefully this is going to be enough for us to do the work in the subsequent chapters. And we're going to find that out by brute force. So this video is pretty much stopping here. I'm going to help whoever's not connected yet get connected, and then we're going to try to go into chapter 13 and see if we can do the work. And if we can't, we might backtrack to 12 a little bit to see if we can just do some rudiments, and then we'll explore from there. If this turns out to be a complete and total failure, and I'm not guaranteeing success here, folks, this is IT. You guys are now delving into the deep waters where it's like what happens is sometimes uncertain. But that's the fun part of IT, too. This is the part that makes this an interesting career path. So video ends here, and I'll catch you in the next one.